Well, good morning, everybody, and it's good to be back with you. As many of you will know, I've been helping out at Christ the King, our neighbouring church, for a little while, so I haven't been around St Michael's, so it's good to be back. I became a Christian while I was at university and got involved with a Christian organisation that worked a lot with students. After I graduated, I carried on with that involvement for quite a few more years. And for most of my 20s, I had a lot of friends of student age. And one consequence of this was that I got invited to a lot of weddings. In fact, I lost count of how many weddings I went to. At least once I got invited to 2 weddings on the same day. And I was best man so many times, I began to think I should turn professional. Then as time went on, of course, these couples began to have children. And I noticed that my friends, who'd previously seemed sane and decent people, had begun to have the most revolting conversations about the most basic aspects of caring for infants. So, you'd be invited round to dinner and then one of them would recount the most recent unpleasant episode. You know, the sort of thing. Well, I knew the nappy needed changing and I was in the queue for the checkout at the supermarket when, you would not believe it. And I just want to say, whoa, too much detail. I really don't need to know. And to be honest, I'd rather not have the full description. And I promised myself that if I ever had children, I would never, ever do that. But you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. Eventually, I got married and had children. And these things became a part of daily life. Maybe you've been through a similar experience. And then one day your partner says to you, you've been a bit longer at the supermarket than usual. And you say, you wouldn't believe it. I was in the queue for the checkout when... And suddenly you realize that you're doing the very thing that you vowed you would never, ever do. And also when I was younger, it seemed to me that whenever old people got together, they seemed to spend all their time talking about the operations that they'd had, sometimes in great detail. Now really, does anyone want to know a step-by-step account of someone else's surgical procedure? Maybe that's just me. But if somebody tells me that they've just had a hip replacement and seems about to embark on the full story with all the Black & Decker detail of sawing bones and all of that, I'm inclined to say, well, I'm glad you've got a new hip, and I hope it's a great success. Now, did you see that Spurs v West Ham match the other week? It was an absolute cracker. And I vowed that when I get old, I am not going to do that. But then, you can guess, a few years ago, I needed a cataract operation. And actually, cataract operations are really very clever and rather interesting. What they do is, we won't go there. But again, I realized that I started to do the very thing that I said I would never do. But the fact is that experience changes everything, doesn't it? When something becomes part of our own experience, our perspective on it changes. When it affects us, when it becomes part of our lives, it all looks very different. I've always been aware, of course, that there's racism in the world. But as a white man, I can't claim to ever really experienced it. It had never touched my life, really. But then my daughter married a person of colour. And even though they currently live in Canada, which is one of the most liberal and tolerant countries on earth, my son-in-law tells me that he encounters some form of racism every day. So suddenly, for me, racism is an issue to my family. And we're able to understand a bit better than we did before because our perspective has changed when it affects us personally. Experience changes our perspective. If we look at something from the viewpoint of being detached and uninvolved, it will look very different from the way that it would if we were a part of it. and if it touched our own daily lives. And this is very important when it comes to our faith, because the Christian faith is much more than merely believing a set of facts and doctrines. It's not just a matter of the intellect. It's a matter of experience, the experience of a relationship with God. If you've been to our 9 o'clock service, which is a bit more traditional than the 10:31, you will probably have joined in with saying the Creed, which is a summary of Christian beliefs. And maybe as you do that, you're able to kind of tick off each statement mentally in your mind as you say it. We believe in one God. Yeah, I believe in God. The Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is, seen and unseen. Yep. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ. Tick. The only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father. Tick. We believe in the Holy Spirit. Tick. And so on. But being a Christian is not just a tick box exercise. It's not just about having the right beliefs. In our reading this morning, the Apostle Peter says of Jesus that though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him. And there's a difference, isn't there, between believing something and believing in something. And there's a difference between believing someone and believing in them. To believe someone is a matter of the intellect. We think about what they say and what they do, and we evaluate whether or not we think they're genuine. Are they telling the truth? But to believe in someone is a matter of trust. It involves some kind of action and response. We can believe someone while remaining detached and uninvolved with them. But if we believe in them, it implies some form of commitment and involvement. There's been some talk in the news over the past week or two about NASA's long-standing plans to send more astronauts to land on the moon. And when the Apollo 11 mission first went there in 1969, there was obviously a huge amount of science and engineering that made it possible. And one critical factor in the calculations was the strength of the force of gravity on the moon. If you plan to land on the moon, and just as important, to then be able to take off from the surface of the moon to return to Earth, you need to know how powerful gravity is. If it's more powerful than you thought, then there's the danger that your spacecraft will crash to the ground and be damaged, or that when you want to return to Earth, it will not be powerful enough to escape from the moon's gravitational force. But of course, nobody had ever been there before. So how could they know what to expect? Well, the answer, of course, was provided quite a while previously by Sir Isaac Newton and his law of universal gravitation. Science was able to accurately predict the force of gravity on the moon. Now, like most of us, I expect, I learned about this at school. And when I was taught it, I believed it. Even as a cocky youngster, I didn't feel I could argue with Sir Isaac Newton. But the astronauts on Apollo 11 did more than just believe it. They believed in it. They believed it to the extent that they were actually willing to stake their lives on that belief. Because when they got strapped into the spacecraft before the launch, they knew that if the theory was wrong, then they would not be coming home. To them, Newton's law of universal gravitation was not just a question on an exam paper. It was a matter of life or death. And of course, we know that their belief was well-founded. What they believed in was true. And they were able to land safely on the moon and lift off again a few days later to return to Earth. And we're thinking about belief this morning. We're embarking on a new sermon series today, which we've entitled Confidence in a Complex World. And over the next few weeks, we'll be thinking about various aspects of confidence. Confidence in who we are and in how we relate to other people. And our subject for this morning is confident in what you believe. There's certainly plenty to be worried about in the world at the moment, isn't there? And it's in some ways hard to feel confident about the future because it's filled with unknowns. The pandemic is causing immense disruption to normal life throughout the world, and nobody has any real idea how long it will go on for. Brexit may have slipped from the news headlines a bit recently, but it's still on the near horizon, and plenty of aspects of that are still unclear. The future's always uncertain to some extent, isn't it? But that uncertainty is very much heightened at the moment. Right now, there are plenty of reasons not to feel confident about the future. But in his letter, Peter talks about believing in Jesus, and he tells us that, firstly, belief in Jesus is a source of great joy, whatever is happening in the world. He tells us that believing in Jesus is like a new birth into a living hope. That's clearly not just a matter of giving assent to a set of beliefs. It's a major transformation of life. And he says that we have an inheritance to look forward to that can never perish, spoil, or fade. A spiritual reality that is unaffected by anything that happens to us here on earth. And these things give us a confidence for the future. And the Apostle Paul also talks about this confidence in his letter to the Ephesians, where he encourages them to grow and to mature in their faith. Ephesians 4:14 and 15 says, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ." Being confident in what we believe is like an anchor which prevents us from being carried along by whatever popular beliefs which challenge God's truth are doing the rounds in our time. Have you ever been on a beach and headed in for a swim, and then after splashing around and swimming for a while, you come out of the water and you can't find where you've left your towel and your bag? And you look around the beach and it doesn't look very familiar, and then you realize that without noticing it, the waves and currents have gently moved you along the beach, so you're actually some distance away from where you started. And sometimes the subtle pressures of our culture can influence us like that. Without realizing, we begin to drift. But being confident in what we believe enables us to identify these insidious pressures and to resist them. Sometimes, though, the pressures are not so subtle, are they? Only a few days ago, the RNLI in Cornwall issued a warning about dangerous rip currents on some beaches, which can catch swimmers unawares and sweep them out to sea. Many of us, I'm sure, know people who've encountered huge challenges in their faith. Maybe some personal tragedy or severe illness, maybe betrayal by someone they trusted. The list is pretty much endless, isn't it? And who have turned their back on God as a result of their experience. Peter recognizes this reality. In verse 6, he says that in this life we do encounter what he refers to as grief in all kinds of trials. But he argues that when we are confident in what we believe, these can serve to prove the genuineness of our faith. And I dare say that those of us who've been Christians for a few years will also know people whose faith has remained firm and sustained them through some terrible experiences. So how do we build a confident faith? Firstly, by spending time with the Bible, because that's the way we get to know Jesus. Peter says, even though you do not see him now, you believe in him. So although we can no longer see Jesus physically, we can get to know him through his word and believe in him. And if you don't feel that you have a confident faith, then as always at St. Michael's, I would recommend the Alpha course, which gives a chance to meet with others and ask questions and to grow in your faith. So we grow in faith through the Bible, but secondly, we build faith by meeting together and encouraging each other. When the Apostle Paul wrote those words about being tossed around by the waves and the wind, he suggested that our relationships are a key way to strengthen our faith. He says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. We run a lot of small groups in St. Michael's, which we call life groups, and many are still managing to meet together despite the current restrictions, either by meeting here in the church centre, where they can observe the social distancing rules, or by meeting online. And if you're not in a life group but you think you might like to join one, again, get in touch with the office or any member of the staff team, and we'd be happy to tell you what groups are available and put you in touch with the leaders. But most importantly for all of us is our need to believe in Jesus. Not just to believe him, but to believe in him. To take that step of placing our trust in him and submitting our lives to him. To paraphrase a well-known astronaut, that may be a small step for a man or a woman, but it's one giant leap in our relationship with God.